Right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Hattingh, Executive Director here at the Centre for Risk Analysis. Thank you all very much for joining us today on the 15th of April, just before we go into this long Easter weekend. Trust all of our clients are keeping well and very busy at this point in time, given everything happening with the GNU, the budget, and of course, globally with the tariffs. Today, though, we're going to focus on things a bit slightly closer to home, talking about issues with local government and municipalities. We're going to go through data from our latest macro review published last month, which looked at the state of municipalities, but we've added for you various other components to also examine the state of municipalities and local government from a social, economic, and political point of view. We'll focus on some of the key metros, but we, of course, realize that there are other areas of the country of equal political and social importance, not necessarily of the same economic weight. We'll look at various aspects in that regard. Joining me to unpack all of this is our main presenter and speaker for today, Deputy Head of Research at the CRA, Gerbrandt van Heerden, and also joining us as a panelist later during the Q&A and the discussion is Marius Roodt from the Institute of Race Relations. Just last little bits of housekeeping before Gerbrandt kicks us off with his presentation. This webinar is being recorded and the recording is available afterwards to all CRA clients. I mentioned the Q&A that will come up after Gerbrandt's presentation. If you have any questions, you can pop them in the comment section on the respective platform where you are watching, and we will get to those during the discussion and the Q&A. And then also lastly, if you are not a CRA premium client, we invite you to become a client, to contact us either during or after the webinar, and we will provide you with more details. But yeah, on that note, before I give us way too much admin and even more information, I'm going to hand over to Gerbrandt to go take us through today's discussion on the state of local government and municipalities in South Africa, entitled Sand in the Gears. Gerrie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So I'm going to get straight into it. I'll start off by saying that President Cyril Ramaphosa, in a recent speech a year or two ago, mentioned that he envisioned South Africa to become a massive construction site where a lot of construction projects would be taking place nationwide. Now, in order for that vision to be realized, there has to be a policy and economic environment that is conducive for business activity, that promotes and accelerates economic growth, and that attracts investment. However, business activity cannot be robust, growth cannot accelerate, and investment cannot be attracted if the basic fundamentals is not present. And that includes the functioning of municipalities and how sustainable they are. So that is what our webinar is going to be about today. We're going to look at the state of municipalities in South Africa. Chris, you can go to the next slide, please. So just a brief overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to look at municipalities in the context of the broader economy. After that, we're going to look at municipal decay. And after that, we're going to see how that affects households and businesses before concluding with a key risk and recommendations section. Chris, you may. All right, so I think it's important for us to start off with our economic hub, Johannesburg. So our story starts with Johannesburg. It is the engine of our economy, biggest city. It has the reputation of being the home of the country's biggest corporates. Everybody goes there for better employment opportunities. And yet, The city was recently, it was recently reported that the city needs at least a minimum of 200 billion rand to fix its infrastructure network. It needs 26 billion rand alone to just halt the collapse of water infrastructure. That's not even expanding the water infrastructure network, just to prevent the collapse. The city is also saddled with an additional 20 billion rand in debt because of the failing e-toll system. And then, of course, the city hasn't had leadership since 2019. There has been 8 mayors in the last few years in the city alone. And that makes it difficult to implement policy reforms, and it's a huge obstacle for service delivery. Chris. All right, so why is this important to look at Johannesburg? Well, Johannesburg is the biggest city in the Gauteng province. And as this slide shows us, this slide looks at the provincial contribution to national gross domestic product. And you can see from that red slice, that represents Gauteng. And Gauteng, therefore, constitutes a third of South Africa's entire GDP for 2023, which means that the cities and municipalities within the Gauteng province play an outsized role in propping up the GDP. Next one. And of course, households and businesses are aware of Gauteng's reputation, and that is what we can see clearly in this slide, which shows net migration between 2011 and 2022. So over a span of a decade. And we can see that Gauteng saw a positive net migration rate of around 400,000 people moving to that province from all other areas in the country, of course, for better economic opportunities. But the Western Cape is not far behind it, with a net positive migration rate of around 300,000 people. So Gauteng and the Western Cape have both emerged as the two economic pillars of South Africa's economy. And therefore, it is very important for these provinces to invest in their municipalities, to invest in their cities, to ensure that their cities have the necessary infrastructure to accommodate the influx of people moving there. Just before we head to the next slide, I also want to just draw your attention to the other provinces quickly. We can see that the Eastern Cape, the Free State, KwaZulu-Natal, and Limpopo have all had a negative net migration rate. So more people are leaving those provinces than entering those provinces. And that, as we will also explain later in this webinar, is because of rural provinces and small towns having a real serious issue with service delivery. So lots of people are fleeing the municipal decay in those areas and moving towards the bigger metros. But then, of course, this presents a dilemma for Gauteng and the Western Cape, because like I said, they have to now ensure that they've got the infrastructure to take people in. So what are people, or rather, what are the provinces spending on infrastructure? Well, in our next slide, we will look at the tabled budgets by metropolitan municipality. So, Chris, if you can click a few times ahead, you will see that the skyscraper there on the left, that is the city of Cape Town, which for the period of 2025 and 2026 has allocated a infrastructure budget of around 14 billion rand. That means that Cape Town has allocated an equivalent amount of money for infrastructure than Johannesburg, Ekurhuleni, and Tshwane combined. So all three Gauteng metros combined constitutes Cape Town's infrastructure budget. Now add to that, Chris, if you can click again, you will see orange bars popping up, and that represents the metropolitan populations of each city. So let's take Johannesburg, for example. Johannesburg has a metropolitan population of 6 million, yet it only invested yet it only allocated an infrastructure budget of around 7 billion, which is half that of Cape Town, which has a much smaller population of around 5 million. So already there are alarm bells ringing for the Gauteng metros. Chris, we can move on to the next one. This slide also just drives away the point that capital expenditure has essentially stagnated over a decade between 2014 and 2024. You'll see the gray line there that represents capital expenditure for Gauteng. And for a while, it was on the right track. It was increasing steadily, but around 2017, that's when it started to drop off. And it has now stagnated around from 10 billion to around 6 billion in 2024. We can move to the next one. Now, in order to deliver services, there has to be sufficient and efficient financial management in municipalities. And so that's why it's also important to look at the municipal audit outcomes from the Auditor General. Now, it's a very colorful graph, so I'll quickly take you through what the different colors will mean. But the Auditor General essentially assigns 5 audit opinions to municipalities based on how much money they spend, where that money is spent, and whether there is irregular and wasteful expenditure. So it looks at the financial health of municipalities. So Chris, if you can click once, you will see these dark green bars popping up. Those are audit opinions that are unqualified with no findings. Those are the best results that you want. They are clean audits. So you want this result. And you can see that the vast majority of municipalities in the Western Cape, there at the top, have received a clean audit. There's some provinces like the Free State, the Northwest, who don't have any clean audits. Chris, if you can click a few more times. The light green bars, they're also relatively okay. Orange bars, those are your qualified with no findings audit opinions. That's where the problems really are starting to emerge. Then we get to the 2 worst results, which is disclaimed audit opinions. Disclaimed audit opinions is represented by those red bars, and those are the worst outcome for municipalities. That's where financial management is in complete disarray. And according to the Auditor General, disclaimed opinions have declined, but so have clean audits. So once again, the management of financial resources are increasingly becoming an issue in the municipal sector. Next one, please, Chris. And because there is such a huge problem with financial management, as well as the fact that many municipal employees don't have the necessary skills or experience, there is a great reliance on consultants to help fill the skills gap. But of course, consultants come with a huge price tag. And it's another critical issue that the Auditor General has noted, is that municipalities are spending exorbitant amounts of money on consultants. But a lot of the times, using consultants does not translate into better service delivery. All right, Chris, you can move to the next one. Now, paying your creditors, making sure you're servicing your debt, that is another major issue facing municipalities at the moment. This graph looks at municipal debt owed to our energy utility Eskom between 2018 and 2025. And you can see that gradual climb since 2018, where the municipal sector owed a total of 14 billion rand in 2018 to Eskom, and that has since escalated to over 90 billion. So a complete worsening deterioration in municipal debt to Eskom. And of course, when Eskom struggles to collect revenue, it doesn't have enough funding or resources to allocate to equipment, to bring on more staff, and to ensure proper maintenance in the provision of electricity. And it's the same story with the water boards that we shall see in the next slide. Water board arrears by province for the period of 2022-2023 once again shows that there are exorbitant amounts of money owed to water boards. The Free State, for example, owes around 7.4 billion rand to the water boards. And once again, if water boards are unable to collect the revenue that they have to use to invest in water infrastructure, that down the line is going to create major problems in terms of water provision. And that's something that we're also going to delve into more deeper in this webinar, and that is South Africa's next big crisis, which is water shedding, a problem that's already very prevalent in Johannesburg, but a lot of smaller municipalities in rural areas are also experiencing that issue in greater and greater degrees. We can move to the next one, Chris. So this brings us to what is actually happening in our municipalities. So, Chris, if you can move to the first slide. The first slide looks at the results from the Department of Sanitation's National Blue Drop Report. Now, the Blue Drop Report allocated quote-unquote blue drop scores to all the water supply systems in the country, essentially rating them between excellent, which is the green bars, and critical, which are the red bars. And a worrying picture here is you will note that in 2014, there were 44 water supply systems that were in excellent condition. So the water there were treated properly, it was drinkable, good quality water, and that has since declined. At the same time, the number of water supply systems that are in the critical stage, that have received the critical BD score, have increased between 2014 and 2023. Chris, you can go ahead and show the picture of the situation. And you can see there the picture over a decade has worsened in terms of our water supply systems. Now, municipalities are not just failing in terms of the quality of water, but also on the quantity of water. Our next slide shows the proportion of households that have indicated that they've experienced water supply disruptions for longer than 48 hours. This was for the year 2023, and this is broken down by metropolitan municipality. And Chris, if you can click for us there, then our audience will see that around a third of households in Nelson Mandela Bay, in Mangaung, in eThekwini, and in Buffalo City have all sat without water for more than 2 days. Now, if we zoom into Johannesburg, Chris, if you can go for us to the next slide. If you click once, then you will see that red line that shows households in Johannesburg's demand for water. And that has remained relatively consistent over the last year. But the scary picture is when we add the supply side, what the city is able to supply. And this is represented by the orange and gray lines. If Chris, if you can click for us there, and you will see a massive gap between what Johannesburg is able to supply in terms of water and what the demand is on a daily basis. And so I'll draw your attention quickly to that sharp dip there. In December, that was when the city was doing maintenance. But since the start of January this year, the demand side per day for water has recovered back to normal levels. And it's clear that Johannesburg is not able to meet the water demands of its citizens. Now, the CRA has done polling, which we've discussed in another webinar today. And one of the questions asked was, what issue is the most important for your municipality to address? And Chris, if you can click all the way to the top, our audience can see that the number one issue on people's minds are the improvement of water infrastructure. So already the crisis of the supply of water, the quality of water, that has now become a primary issue across the country. Your access to clean and drinkable water is the foundation for a civilized modern society. Without that, that creates an environment that is not conducive for business, and that is highly that creates a breeding ground for instability and social discohesion. Now, the failure of electricity provision and water provision, all of that harms households and businesses in terms of their resources, in terms of their financial health. And this we can see in the next slide, where we see a pie that shows household consumption expenditure by division of expenditure for the 2022 period. This is from Status A's latest income and expenditure survey. And I want to draw your eyes to that pink slice there on the left. That is the third biggest expenditure item. It is transport. The reason why households have to spend so much on transport is, the answer lies in the next slide, which is the complete collapse of our railway system. Households and businesses no longer have access to a functioning railway system within their cities, within their towns. you can see from 2018, there were around 26 million passenger railway journeys occurring, and that has since fallen to around 5 million in recent years. So even though the government has made some progress in improving this status of PRASA, getting some private sector involvement in helping the railways get back on track, it's still far below pre-pandemic levels. And without reliable and efficient trains, without reliable and efficient buses, households have to resort to alternative transport such as taxis and private vehicles. And these are much more expensive modes of transport. Chris, if you can go to the next slide, we can see how the failure in infrastructure is adding to the cost of living for average citizens. This graph looks at the cost of commuting as a share of earnings. So this was a graph taken from the World Bank in 2025, and it showed that around South African workers, especially in that second chart you will see, in the second pie chart, 80% of their of the poorest of the earnings of the poorest South African workers are allocated just to commuting, and that compares poorly when we click again to Vietnam workers, who spend just 10% of their earnings on commuting. And just to further drive away the point, if we can move to the next slide, this chart looks at workers traveling for longer than 30 minutes to their place of work. Tshwane, the city of Tshwane, way at the top there, that red bar at the top, half of workers in Tshwane have to travel longer for 30 minutes to get to the city centers, to get to the business nodes. And once again, without reliable public transport that is affordable, a lot of households have to allocate additional money towards commuting, towards transport, money that could have been used on other essential items such as healthcare, such as education, such as a roof and shelter. Now, another major thorn in the side of South Africans is, of course, a very old issue that everybody's familiar with, and that is load shedding. In the next slide, we can see that this graph shows load shedding's impact on township operations. So the government has claimed that they have load shedding under control, that it's something that's now in the past. But we've had a few breakdowns in power stations earlier this year, and load rotation and localized load shedding is still a major problem affecting many municipalities across the country. And a Nedbank report specifically looked at the township economies and businesses within informal settlements and how they function during load shedding. And the scary picture is that 2/3 of township businesses, that is that big red slice there in the pie chart, are unable to do anything during load shedding. So when the lights are out, they completely cease operations, and they will only restart once the lights are back on. Another 17% are able to make additional plans. They can travel to a different location. They can focus on other tasks or administration. And just under 20% are lucky enough to have alternative energy sources such as an inverter or a generator or a solar panel. But the point is that the vast majority of poor workers and businesses in formal settlements are unable to proceed with their operations during load shedding. And so this is the crux of the story. Municipalities crumbling, they don't just affect their local businesses and the locals that live there, but it has a much broader impact nationwide. This we can see in the next slide, which shows real annual provincial economic growth between 2015 and 2023. So the red bars are 2015 and the gray bars are 2023. And we can zoom in on our economic pillars, Gauteng and the Western Cape. They both grew around 2.8% around in the 2022 period, which is the orange bars. They've since slowed down considerably to less than 1% in 2023. So our economy is growing at a sluggish pace, and as many of our presentations have shown, there is a direct link between high economic growth, investment, and job creation. So municipalities crumbling is dragging growth down, and that at the same time is preventing wealth creation and job creation in the country. So we can move on to our third and final section, where we are looking at local sentiment or grassroots sentiment. What are people experiencing on the ground, and what do they perceive? So we can start our story off by looking at the perfect storm surrounding the Heerden River municipality. That is where Koster is. It's a small town in the northwest province, but it's essentially the poster child of what is happening in the rest of South Africa. This town, this municipality, has had numerous disclaimed audit opinions from the Auditor General every year. The town has come under severe sabotage from water mafias, sabotaging the town's water infrastructure so that they can come with their water trucks to provide water to the desperate citizens. Financial management in this town is in complete disarray, and a lot of money is not being allocated where it has to go. A lot of wasteful expenditure and lots of opportunity of corruption has also been noticed and uncovered in Koster. And a lot of money that was supposed to go towards settling accounts has been diverted to other unproductive areas, and that has led to the ballooning of Eskom debt. And the result was businesses completely exiting the main street in Koster. It was a complete exodus of businesses in that town. But there is a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel for Koster. In the next slide, we can see that business and civil society came together to do something about it. The ratepayers associations stepped in, and along with the business community, they took the municipality to the court, where the court granted the municipality power to have full control over their water system and their sanitation system. And within the months that business and civil society in Costa were able to fix the taps and fix their sanitation facilities, there was a bit of a revival going on in that town. They even took over the dilapidated old post office building, which they renovated and leased to 3 tenants, including to a private security firm. One solution to municipal decay is to get more grassroots level movements to play a more active role. Residents associations, businesses, and NGOs. Unfortunately, the downside to this is the additional cost to the consumer, to households and to businesses, because now not only are they paying property rates, they're also paying taxes, and now they have to fork additional money out into fixing the roads, fixing water infrastructure, fixing the power stations. So this is a short-term solution, but the actual golden solution will be to fix the management at the top and to get government to function properly again at local level. Which brings us to our final section. Before we move to our final section, just a few more slides on some of the polling that has been done around what citizens are experiencing. So this slide, for example, looks at the satisfaction with local government initiatives in growing the economy and creating jobs. And this was a survey that was done in Hattingh. And the main takeaway point here is that in 2015, Chris, if you can zoom all the way, the yellow and red blocks there show that around 60% of respondents in Hattingh in 2015 were completely dissatisfied with their local government's initiative in propping up the economy and creating jobs. And that has since worsened to over 80% in the 2023-2024 period. And of course, that has had an impact on elections. We've seen in our watershed election last year, 2024, the national elections, there was a complete change up. The ANC has dropped below 50% in most metropolitan municipalities. You can see there with the green bars. The only 2 metropolitan municipalities where the ANC achieved over 50% was Mangaung and Buffalo City. Everywhere else, they have fallen either just below 50 or very far below 50%. Opposition parties now make up a huge chunk in metropolitan areas. Now, this, of course, has led to coalition governments. Some have been more stable than others. My colleague Marius will be able to elaborate more on that. But if I'm correct, eThekwini has proven to be a more stable coalition. But of course, our Hattingh metros have seen complete the different mayor every few months, and it's difficult to implement reforms there and to get service delivery moving there when you don't have stable government where opposition parties can come to the table and get to work. And then in the next slide, we also see the growing discontent with the ANC. This is groundbreaking polling from our latest polling results that we released today. And it shows that the Democratic Alliance in orange bars is either the equivalent of the ANC or has surpassed the ANC support in many of the metropolitan cities. And then, Chris, if you can click to our last slide. As growth stagnates and employment increases, that's going to lead to a lot of social discohesion and instability. And this we can clearly see with this graph showing service delivery protests between 2004 and 2022. In 2004, around 27 service delivery protests took place. That was already a lot back in that year, and that has since escalated to nearly 200 in recent years. There was a slight dip in 2020, but of course that was the lockdown restrictions that curbed movement. But since then, service delivery protests have moved back to their pre-pandemic levels, and that's going to continue as long as infrastructure is collapsing, but as well as because of the issue of water. Water is an essential to households to survive, for businesses to operate. It's a much more critical issue than load shedding, and that's the next big crisis that's going to lead to a lot of instability in the country. And in our final section, the key risks and recommendations, I'm just going to quickly run through it, and then I'm going to allow the audience to have their say in the Q&A section. But firstly, there's financial mismanagement that's threatening services. Businesses and people are fleeing failing towns and rural areas. Underinvestment in infrastructure, especially in metropolitan municipalities. And it's only going to get worse with high urbanization. The next big crisis, as I've mentioned, water shedding. And then with the failure of service delivery across the board now in every category, that's all leading to a rise in cost of living and less free money for other necessities, both for businesses and for households. And then, of course, the growing social instability, which is going to become a much more prevalent feature, especially in the Gauteng metros and the more rural areas of this country. So what are our recommendations? So, Chris, we recommend removing expensive and ineffective national legislation that has proven to be a huge barrier to sound management, and it has led to a huge exodus in skills. And Chris, if we can run through the rest of the bullet points there, we need greater accountability. We need to confront criminal networks, and we need to motivate public-private partnerships where necessary. And on that note, I'm going to end it here, and our audience can please ask us anything now in the Q&A section. And thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much, Harry. Very, very good presentation. A lot of detail for us to cover in government and municipalities. So that's partly why it's such a challenge, I think, making sense of fixing some of these issues, given that it becomes so pervasive, the challenges. We'll go through what we have in terms of chat box. But before that, Marius, I'm going to start off with you, just in terms of looking towards 2026, the local government election, if one considers the trend line with previous local elections and last year's national and provincial elections, would a change mostly away from the ANC in the Gauteng metros, do you think that would be the cure? Would that be the panacea to everything that ails the three big metros in Gauteng?
Yeah, it's difficult. Just getting voting the ANC out isn't going to necessarily be silver bullet that the country needs. And we've seen the ANC has been voted out in Gauteng metros before, but those governments have been pretty unstable. Yeah, so I think it also comes down to our politicians and deciding to do what's best for the country. But I'd just like to make a couple of points on the issue of running water. I think something that always makes me think about the issues in South Africa is that you could probably argue that the Roman Empire, 2,000 years ago, people living in urban areas in Rome, when the Roman Empire probably had better access to running water and sanitation than many people do in South Africa today. The famous aqueducts and so on, people were probably had more access to clean water than many South Africans. And I think it's also important to point out the growth in South Africa's urban population. Today, about 70% of South Africans live in an urban area. More than 40% of South Africans live in one of the 8 metros. So that also puts pressure on infrastructure and so on. But we've also seen there has been a change in politics. If you take our 8 metros as a single kind of entity, then the DA is actually, looking at the 2024 election results, the DA is actually the biggest party in those 8 metros, if we take it as a consolidated unit. It's very slightly ahead of the ANC. And amazingly, it's much bigger than the ANC in eThekwini. Obviously, a lot of those votes went to MK, but I think it also shows how people in urban areas vote differently from people in the rest of the country. And that's not just South Africa. That's something you see around the world. I mean, in the UK, people in cities vote differently from people in the rural areas. The US, India, it's all that. It's definitely a global phenomenon. And there's also a problem with people not being involved in voting for their local governments. In the 2021 local government election, 70% of eligible voters didn't vote. 40% of registered voters voted, and 30% of eligible voters. So that's everybody, all South African citizens over the age of 18. So that's actually quite a big problem. If people are checking out of the kind of democratic process, they maybe don't see voting as a legitimate way of making their grievances heard. And that's when you see increases in protests and so on, because people see that as the only way that they can actually be heard. So I think there's also needs to be a change in political culture, maybe amongst voters and amongst politicians. And we also maybe need to think about reforming local governments in South Africa. Does it make sense that a place is a municipality and it doesn't really have a tax base with very few businesses and people who earn enough to pay rates and taxes? Should every single part of South Africa be covered by a municipality? Should we maybe give thought to places being governed from the provincial capital or from Pretoria? I mean, if you look at London, for example, London has, I don't know, it's about very big population, 10 to 15 million people, whatever it is, but it's broken up into 32 boroughs. And the borough with the largest population is Croydon, which has fewer than 400,000 people. So that's maybe something we need to look at. There's one government for London, but it's very decentralized. And as I say, there's 32 little local governments where that's the real coalface of service delivery. Of course, there's very big differences between London and South African cities, but that's something we need to think about. Should we have one entity covering the whole of Joburg of near over 5 million people? I mean, Joburg, the municipality, has more people than many countries. It's got more people than Botswana and Namibia, more people than Eswatini and Lesotho. So maybe that's also what we need to think about. And just on the issue of service delivery, even if, say, a company can provide their own electricity and their own water, and they're in a dysfunctional municipality, there's still other issues. There's the famous example of the people who made Omar Rusks. They actually had to move their factory because the roads were so bad from the factory. When their trucks were leaving, the there would be such the trucks would rattle around so much on the potholed roads that by the time the rusks got to the depot, they'd all be broken. And obviously, somebody doesn't want to get their Omar rusk when they have their morning coffee and there's nothing left of it. There's nothing really to dip into your coffee. So even if you can kind of state-proof yourself, you can't state-proof yourself from, say, a badly maintained road. And I think that's also something to look at. So breakdown in municipal governance has real consequences for people who live there and for companies. And when companies leave, that's obviously has issues to do with then jobs leave and also a tax base leaves. And so it's got really big, it really causes big issues when there's such a breakdown in municipal governance.
Marius, when we talk about growth potential, it's often the Western Cape is touted as, you know, the province. We've seen it in terms of semigration. Unfortunately, Cape Town specifically has the problem where they dropped a mountain in the middle of their city, so there's a bit of constraints there with just available area and surface area. But some other provinces, maybe some thoughts that from your side that jump out in terms of growth potential. For me, I mean, if you look to the north of the country, places like Limpopo and Mpumalanga, do you think some of these issues of basic governance, financial management, if they get some of those things right with the right sort of support from national, from provincial, from their businesses and their communities, I think there could be serious growth potential in other parts of the country as well.
Definitely. I think part of it is just having a decent government. I think so many places in South Africa have so much growth potential, you know, from if it's agriculture or tourism or whatever the case is. I mean, there's just so much potential in South Africa, and it's retarded by having poor governance, whether it's at national level or local government level. And it's something, I mean, that's why people are going to the Cape, and we've also seen lots of companies also moving headquarters to the Cape, and part of it is because the Cape is generally a bit better run than the rest of the country. It's something, I don't think it's something you can really argue about. And you know, I think a lot of people also they want places like Johannesburg and Durban or eThekwini to work. They're important places, and you know, if Joburg fails, then Gauteng fails, and maybe South Africa fails. So it's something that we really have to focus on, and it comes down to people who are in leadership positions. That comes down to a culture within political parties and with for voters. If you keep voting for the same kind of political parties and expecting a different outcome, I mean, that's the definition of insanity. So, but then, as I say, there's also the problem of people of declining voter turnout, which is also a problem in itself. So yeah, it's there's loads of potential in South Africa, obviously, but we have to get the basics right. And too often, I think that's simply what doesn't happen. If a company can't have guaranteed water, electricity, or as I was saying, you know, decent road outside their factory, then they're obviously not going to come invest or whatever the case is. And even when it comes to tourism, you know, if somebody wants to come to a part of South Africa, you know, go look at the leopards or whatever the case is, but if the chalet that they've booked, there's no electricity, there's no running water, they can't get there with an ordinary car, then people aren't going to go there. It's the basics that you have to get right, and unfortunately, I don't think we're doing that.
Talking about companies getting more involved, we have this phenomenon, a bit of not even double taxation, in some cases triple taxation or quadruple taxation. So you pay your rates and taxes, but then when there isn't water service delivery, electricity, private security, companies and households who can afford it, of course, need to shell out even more to make up the gaps there. So a question here from the audience, Marius, specifically around how we see national retailers supporting consumers at their crisis points and points of need, and whether it may be possible for them to play a constructive role to relieve some of the trauma. I think we have seen good examples of that sort of thing. I should, just before you offer some insight there, Marius, I should also say the opportunity to try and influence the policy and legislation space to target what policies make it difficult for either local municipalities to get brought back up to an adequate level, or national legislation that might in many ways lead to resources being wasted. If you talk about things like public procurement, where we see waste so much year after year, I think from a corporate point of view, to either do that directly in terms of what the company does, or to support organizations such as the Institute of Race Relations, which does lobby for these policy reforms that would then in turn, I think, make the ground for businesses to engage in the sort of way to take up some of the slack being left by government, to make that a more productive endeavor versus just, taking a bucket and shoveling water out of a boat that's just sinking the whole time. But what do you think of national retailers stepping in here with some of these challenges?
I think it's a stopgap solution. It's not sustainable. The job of a big company or national retailer isn't to do the government's job for them. And I think companies will also be, if they invested in South Africa, but they have to fork out 10 or 20% of their income to fixing things that the government should be doing. That also looks that, people will start thinking, is it worth being in South Africa? And if they do step in and fill the gap where the government is, then the government also checks out. They decide, this company is going to do it for us. We've already seen there's been protests around some mines in South Africa where like a big mine will kind of take over the functions of the local government because the local government's so useless. It'll provide electricity or water or some housing or whatever. But then when there is a problem, the local people then protest at the mine instead of the local municipality, because the mine has in a way taken over the government's functions, and it shouldn't have to do that. Of course, companies do have some social responsibility, but their function isn't to take over what the government's supposed to do. And I think it's, as I say, it's not sustainable. And even when with local communities taking over some of the functions and what we've seen around some parts of the country, it's a stopgap solution. It's not sustainable, and it's not something that we can carry on doing. And yeah, like I say, I think companies who, if they have to do it, they'll start rethinking their investment strategy in South Africa. If they see that they have to take over some of the government's functions. I mean, Pick n Pay shouldn't be doing what the government's doing. The Pick n Pay, its job is to sell food and products to the customers. It's not to, retar roads or whatever the case is.
No, absolutely. Marius, just maybe a final question as we wrap up now. We touched on things such as thresholds. And you, for example, are busy. I think one of your main focuses this year will be on electoral reform and what sort of work can be done in that regard. I guess one of the concerns around thresholds, whether it's national for the National Assembly, whether it's municipalities or provincial legislatures, is then it makes it more difficult for smaller parties to either emerge or contest because they have to reach a certain threshold, quote unquote. Just your sort of high level thoughts on that kind of thing. I think it's all in all, it's important to keep in mind addressing the sand in the gears challenge that local governments pose to growth is going to require various angles of attack. It's going to require legislative reform. It's going to require policy reform. It's going to require businesses and communities stepping up and filling gaps and working with councillors and local government where they can. But just your thoughts on the electoral reform side. Can that be one of these sort of arrows in our quiver that we use to address some of these challenges?
Yeah, thresholds is quite a fraught topic. There's lots of thought being given to it. But if you have a threshold, you also help the bigger parties. In eThekwini, for example, 19 parties got into the municipal council, having less than 1% of the vote. 15 of those parties got only one seat. But say if you had a 1 or 2% threshold in eThekwini, the ANC would have been very close to a majority, even though it only got about 40% of the vote in eThekwini in 2021. So thresholds helps bigger parties in general. And there's also a question of democracy and freedom of association. People should be able to vote for whoever they want. And is it right to have a threshold that keeps these political parties out? I mean, there's an argument for both sides, I think. But also we've had these small parties. We had Al Jamaa getting 2 mayors in Joburg. They've also, I think it was the ARC had a mayor in Ekurhuleni where I stay. But these parties didn't vote for themselves to become the mayor. The Al Jamaa had only 3 councillors in Joburg out of the 270. The reason Al Jamaa got 2 mayors in a row was because the big parties like the ANC and the EFF voted for these guys. It wasn't the small parties' fault that they had these, I mean, with all due respect to Tapelo Ahmed and Kabela Gwamanda, I mean, I don't think necessarily guys who cut out for the task of running South Africa's biggest city. But they were obviously, I mean, we can talk about their actions, but the reason we had these silly small mayors in charge was because of the big parties like the ANC and EFF voting for them. So it also comes down to a change of political culture. And yeah, there's as I say, the discussion around thresholds is pretty fraught. I'm not completely against it, but it's something we should think about. But as I say, it also helps big parties. We just saw in Germany now, they've formed a coalition between the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats with just over 50% of the seats in the German parliament, even though those two parties together only got 45% of the votes. So thresholds generally helps big parties. And so that's what we have to think about. But, there's always trade-offs when we come to electoral systems and so on. And this is one of them. But there's no guarantee that having a threshold is going to create stability in the system. That's up to the bigger parties. They're actually the ones who have more power than these small parties. But there's also still the issue of kingmakers and smaller parties acting as spoilers. So it's not an easy question to answer, and it's pretty complex. But thresholds is something that a lot of countries around the world use, and it's something that we should definitely still look at, I think.
No, absolutely. I think if there's one thing we all need to get more comfortable with, it is the up and down roller coaster of our era of coalition government at a national and provincial level. This is the system of democracy we have. It's working as it should. I'm not saying it's easy to navigate, but it is ultimately working as it should. So the challenge and the opportunities there for us as think tanks, civil society, and of course businesses to reform and change things to the best level that I think we can, but also not pretend that we're going to reach some sort of utopian stage at any point. We shouldn't sell ourselves or others in terms of that. But we have come up to the full hour here. So Marius, I'm going to thank you. I'm going to thank Gerbrandt very much in his absence for his excellent presentation. To all of you who joined us, thank you for your time today. We trust that you enjoyed and found useful the data and the analysis we provided today. As I mentioned beforehand, if you aren't yet a premium client of the CRA, we invite you to become one. Please contact me following this webinar. I also mentioned earlier the recording will be made available, of course, to our clients. If there are any questions or queries that we didn't get to in the discussion now, please also share those with me afterwards. On that note, thank you all once again very much, and we'll see you all again in our next CRA webinar. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.